absolutely not. And we didn't expect the Iranian cheap but
Yeah,
deadly
that's right.
drones either.
That's right.
We
Yeah.
thought all innovation is ours.
But clearly, Russia has moved from let's fight this on the cheap
Yeah,
to we're now going to win it and dictate the terms under which we will live in the future in Eastern Europe.
right.
That's where we're headed. And that's when you begin to look at these axes. Where could they go? Well, clearly, the ideal way to handle Ukrainian defenses is to attack them from behind. I would be very
Yes, yes,
surprised if
yeah,
that did not happen because you have enough forces on the western side, on the eastern side of Kharkov,
right.
that could easily come across and turn south.
You were saying that the Ukraine around Kharkov, facing Belgorod,
Yeah.
is has a very thin screen right now
Well,
for
it did.
forces.
It did. And they abandoned it. That's why they abandoned it. They had 2,000 men,
Ah,
and they just simply abandoned Kharkov, that entire corridor, all the way down to the river. But my point is they now have a large concentration facing that. That could conceivably be channeled over the river and back into Ukraine. But
yeah.
instead of going north, which is what people would think, oh, we're going to Kiev, no. It turns south. And it meets the other concentration coming up from the south.
Well, let's talk about that in a
And
sense.
let me
Yeah.
finish one
Oh,
thing
sure,
here.
sure.
These two things I think will happen.
Right.
The real question is what happens in Belarus. And that concentration, if it comes down, it could have the effect that Incheon did. A
Yeah.
lot of people don't remember that what was nice about Incheon was not simply we struck where the enemy was weak, but they were positioned in such a way that the North Korean forces had to retreat. They realized their position was hopeless and started rushing northward for fear that they would be encircled and destroyed. And I think it could make a lot of sense for the
Yeah.
Russians to do something
To
similar,
catch the
and then everyone
right.
runs north on the east side of the river to get out of the trap.
Well, the examples we have from history, because now we've gotten into the dynamic that follows fortification and effective fires, and that's the maneuver that occurs after you break through. And essentially, the war has in many ways resembled, since say April,
Mm-hmm.
a siege in the Donbass or elsewhere as well,
Mm-hmm.
all
Mm-hmm.
along this 1,100-kilometer front. Now, Americans have assumed that this has to be a Russian breakout, that somehow they have to break through. And because of the distraction, say, of Bakhmut, there is this assumption that the Russians are going to have to bleed themselves white trying to break through the Ukrainian front. Now, you've just laid out ways in which they could get around that. And it also suggests some examples from history where the um, the Gustav Line had held us at the top of Neapolitan
Mm-hmm.
Italy. And finally, even though we had a terrible time breaking out, we finally broke out from Anzio
Mm-hmm.
and boom, immediately got to Rome, and the Germans had to retreat to the north. Same with the breakout in Normandy. But what you're suggesting is the conditions for breakout are not so demanding now. A, because the Ukrainian army is much less effective
Mm-hmm.
and much weakened, and also that there are areas where a breakthrough would not be that hard. And what I'd like to ask you is if you can have a breakthrough, say, from Belgorod or from uh, south of Minsk, what would the forces in the south, in the Zaporizhian area, would they try and break through what are strong defenses or just
Well,
hold the Ukrainians?
again, if they can attack simultaneously or near simultaneously from both sides,
Everything will crack.
then it will fall apart quickly.
I see. Yeah.
Listen, no one should diminish in any way the fighting skills and power of the Ukrainians. Ukrainians were always good soldiers. They were good soldiers under
Their
the czars.
casualties attest to that.
Yeah, and they were good soldiers in the Wehrmacht, and
Yes.
they were good soldiers in the Soviet army. So I think that's nonsensical. But you can only expect so much from any human being.
Right. Right.
These people have been exhausted. They've been bled white, and they don't have the experienced cadre they once had. You know, by October of 1943,
Right.
the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, had lost 55,000 officers.
That's stunning.
That's incomprehensible. That means that most of the talent, not all of it, but most of the talent, particularly at the lowest level,
Yeah.
these are the
Yeah.
people that ran all over Europe for
That's
years.
right. That's right.
They were gone or they were wounded. And as a result, the German army's offensive striking power after the fall of 43 is dramatically reduced
Yes,
and
it is.
quite frankly inadequate. I think the Ukrainians are in a similar position right now.
Well, when the Russians do launch, will have to be a maneuver offensive to carry out and exploit and reach their goals. Have the Russians adapted in ways that will, um, in terms of their combat unit organization and in terms of the manner of how the offensive will unfold, uh, sort of leave behind the unwieldy kind of organizational structure of divisions and corps and armies that most Americans think of in terms of maneuver
Well,
warfare.
they really already have. When they went through a series of reforms,
Hmm.
you ended up with a vast majority were in what I would call large mobile brigade groups.
Uh-huh.
These are usually 5 to 6,000, sometimes 4 to 5,000, sometimes 3,000. Depends on
Right.
whether this is a tank-heavy operation or mostly motorized infantry or mechanized infantry. They do have motorized rifle divisions. They are 8,000 men strong. They're the largest formations in the Russian army, but they have been used primarily
Right.
as assembly areas. In other words, bring it in and then commit it to other formations to fight, as opposed to sending in a division sized unit. All of these formations are commanded by generals. And what we did see, even with the battalion tactical groups, which was a new innovative
Right.
approach, which had some merit. I think RUSI is saying the Russians have abandoned it. I'd be surprised if that were the case, but they're the only ones saying it. But they did have situations where they had one of these brigade group headquarters that was managing 7 or 8 of these battalion tactical groups
Right.
simultaneously. We're much more rigid in our thinking as we were in 1942, 43, and
Yep.
44. So it's incomprehensible that we would do business that way. But the Russians, even towards the end of the war, would have as many as 7 to 10 divisions under one army headquarters, which was a corps equivalent. Unthinkable for us,
That's right.
but
So
it gained enormous ground quickly.
so you have generals commanding brigades then
Yes,
in Russia.
yeah.
That's something that you don't have in the
Well, the
U.S.
British Army does. The
Right.
British
But
Army has brigade battle groups, but they don't usually have more than 4
right.
combat battalions in a brigade battle group. But the Russians are demonstrating, oh, we can do better.
That's an
They're
overstretch.
more
Yeah.
flexible and agile in this
Exactly.
sense.